Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got the whole crew with us today, Kipp Adams and Benjamin Wolk, coming to you on Halloween, a Tuesday, as we get ready for Missouri Week with the Bulldogs. A lot to talk about on this episode of the podcast as we kind of shake the cobwebs off of a visit to Jacksonville and get ready for what looks like will be another exciting week for Georgia football. We're going to start going back to Saturday's big win over Florida. Georgia wins 43-20. At one point, Georgia scored 36 unanswered points in that big win in Jacksonville. Looked a little squirrely early with Florida having that big drive to open the game. Then the Georgia Bulldogs really turned it on and were able to win that one pretty decisively. Ben, I'm going to start with you. You were there with me in the press box in Jacksonville, especially a few days removed from the action. What sort of still sticks with you from how Georgia won that game and maybe what you learned from that performance?
If there were any questions about this Georgia football team, to me, they were answered on Saturday against Florida. That's not to say that there might, I see Kipp's face there makes me think he might have some questions. So I guess we'll let him get to any remaining questions that he might have. But to me, it was, what is this team going to look like without Brock Bowers? All of those questions were answered. Georgia's going to have weapons all over the place. There have been questions about what is this Georgia defense going to look like since it's not generating the pass rush that it needs to be as successful of a defense as it has been. And I think that those questions were answered in that game. I think that if there were any doubts about whether or not this Georgia team has the switch that it's required to be the Georgia that we've seen the last two seasons, I don't think that those questions exist anymore. So I think that, I guess if there's a question, I'll question myself here. If there is a question, it will be, why has Georgia given up first drive touchdowns in 3 of their 4 SEC games so far? I think Kirby asked that after the game. After everybody asked him about slow starts to start the year, I think because there was such a connotation around it being offensive, like why are there these offensive slow starts? Now that everyone has sort of accepted the fact that this Georgia offense is as firepowered of an offense as Georgia's had, in my opinion, the questions might be, what is this? Why is this Georgia defense maybe a little overzealous on opening possessions? Why have they had issues maybe tackling or in coverage or space or whatever that might be early in games? But really, that's the only question that I would have about this Georgia team remaining, because I think that they went into Jacksonville. They showed their talent gap against a team that was playing its best football of the season. And even though they got punched in the mouth early, there were no doubts whatsoever who was going to come out on top in that football game. And I think that it sets a really positive tone for Georgia heading into these last few weeks of the regular season.
Kipp, you were nodding very, very approvingly, it seemed, when Ben was making that point. What are your takeaways, or what were your thoughts about how that game played out?
Yeah, it's still fascinating to me that Georgia has allowed, opening possession touchdowns to Vanderbilt, South Carolina, and Florida. I think, credit to those offensive coordinators. It seems like when they're playing on script, they have some things that they saw that allowed them to have early success. But, at the same time, I'm going to credit this coaching staff. I think over the last couple of years, they've been one of, if not the best as far as adjustments. And you kind of see that as the game goes on. And you saw that in the Florida game. There was like a 4 possession stretch after, that first drive where Georgia had 4 sacks, and the net yardage Florida got on those 4 drives was -1 yard. And so right there, I think it's just a reminder that Glenn Schumann, Kirby Smart, Will Muschamp, I think these guys do know a little bit about defense. And, even with what looks like a kind of a different roster as far as just that star power on defense, that they're able to, find some ways to still affect opposing offenses. So I think, that still kind of stood out as far as the big picture. And then also just kind of, you don't want to trade, touchdowns for field goals. And again, early in the game, you kind of saw that, Georgia wasn't really firing in all cylinders when they would get down in the red zone. And I know, we always enjoy the game thread on the Junkyard because, everyone loves Mike Bobo when they get down in the red zone and see those early down runs. Although in this game, I think it kind of led to some play action later on. But I think overall, looking ahead at the schedule, you know that you're going to have to define pay dirt when you get in the end zone. So that's still kind of a question for me. But overall, I kind of loved what the offensive line did. I think between the tackles and overall and blocking, probably the best performance of the season. And I mean, that's impressive when you still don't have Amarius Mims out there. So I think that's kind of where I'm kind of giving credit to Stacey Searles, who is also one of the favorite assistants on the Junkyard. And I think his arc so far from the day he was hired to now, it has been really entertaining to watch. And I don't know if this will be the year that they win the Joe Moore Award, but I do think that they're playing outstanding football on the offensive line right now.
They've certainly played really, really well, especially when you consider that Amarius has been out and that they've had to kind of play musical chairs at times. Only other thoughts really for me, credit to the offense. The first game without Brock Bowers, we were all curious what it would look like. And not only did they play really well, but, I sort of thought, well, we could maybe see a slow start, maybe a couple drives where they're sort of trying to find themselves. That really didn't happen. I mean, they had to settle for a field goal in the first drive. But outside of that, they were rolling. Like Ben talked about earlier, really impressed with how the defense played. I thought that game, it wasn't a mirror image of that 21 game where, Georgia scores 3 touchdowns in like 2 minutes of game time or something absurd. But once Smile Munden made that stop on that 4th down, it just was like hit after hit after hit in Georgia's favor. And that's how you separate yourself from lesser teams. I do really like what Billy Napier's doing in Gainesville, and I think that they are accumulating the talent they need. But that roster is not in a position where it should be competing with Georgia right now. And Georgia took advantage of that. They did not let that Gators team hang around, had the stop on the 4th down. Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, who I thought had an outstanding game back, forces that fumble. Marvin Jones Jr. recovers it on like the 11. Georgia scores another touchdown. They block that punt. Jonell Aguero getting in there and blocking the punt for 2 more points. Georgia just took advantage, in my opinion, of the opportunities that a lesser Florida team presented them. And, I talked to Graham Hall, who's with Swamp 24/7, who was on the podcast last week. And we were talking, I think it might have been after the game, but he said, Georgia got the breaks in this game that Florida had to have if it was going to make it close. And it kind of, him saying that reminded me of that LSU game where, in the SEC title game last year, Georgia has a weird deflection where Smile Munden makes an interception and Chris Smith picks up the blocked field goal and runs it back for a touchdown. Those are the kind of moments and the kind of plays, if you're playing Georgia, you've got to have if you're going to beat a very good Georgia team. And Georgia had the skills on their side, and they also had their luck on their side against Florida. Turning the page to Tuesday night, which some of you may be listening to this after the fact, but around 7 o'clock Eastern time, the first college football playoff rankings will be released. Obviously, there's a lot of interest around where Georgia will be in these rankings. So I thought it would be a good idea for each of the 3 of us to go through what we expect to see from these rankings. And I'll start and then I'll throw it to you, Ben. But my expectation, I think we're going to see Ohio State as the number 1 team. I think that win over Penn State is going to give them a lot of fuel. So I think the Buckeyes get number 1. I think Georgia is going to be number 2. I think that there are some impressive wins on their resume. As much as folks have poked holes in the schedule, which even we have done at times, there are some impressive wins on their slate. And even if the playoff committee doesn't want to put a whole lot of credence in them being back-to-back defending champions, I think that will matter at least a little bit. Number 3, I think, is going to be Florida State. I think that win over Clemson, even though Clemson is not quite as good as it has been in years past, I think that still matters. And I think the Seminoles have done a very good job of taking care of business week after week and have put themselves in good position. 4, I kind of went back and forth on this. I'm going to give it to Michigan, although I could see Washington being number 4 with that win over Oregon. But I think the Wolverines have taken care of business. The expectations around that program, albeit with everything that's going on right there in Ann Arbor right now, I think Michigan gets that number 4 spot and is definitely going to be within that conversation, even if they wind up not being in at number 4. Ben, what do you think? How do you see the top 4 sort of doling out when we get to this on Tuesday night?
Well, I think that the committee, I think this is always the hardest one to decide. I think by the end of the year, it's actually usually pretty easy. And as critical as people typically can be of the committee, I think more often than not, they're pretty consistent in their reasoning behind why they favor certain teams over other teams early in the year. And I think generally it is, they're not weighing a ton on what you've done in the past. They're weighing it on who have you beaten this season? Who are your good wins? And they're obviously going to view good wins as other teams that they're ranking in their college football playoff rankings. And I think because of that, I agree with you, Jordan. I think Ohio State will be number one, because even though I might not view them as the best team in the country right now, I do think with the wins against Notre Dame and Penn State, they're going to have those two top 15 college football playoff ranking wins. And that's going to outweigh pretty much anybody else, I would think, in terms of the way the committee typically views things. So that's why I would have them number one. I think another way that they typically measure things is game control. So like, how much have you really controlled the games? What is your, win probability, some of those analytic type of things, like how much have you dominated the football games that you've been in? I think that will favor teams like Georgia and Michigan, but I also still think that the win over LSU will probably be viewed higher for Florida State than Georgia. So I actually think Georgia at best will be the number 3 team tonight. I think that's where it gets a little bit interesting because, I've already mentioned the wins that you have against, the other 2 teams, the wins that they have. Washington arguably has the best win in college football right now. But I think that from the game control standpoint, when you're playing a team like Stanford and struggling late like that, that has to factor in to like you not controlling the game whatsoever at the end has to factor in some capacity, even with that win over Oregon. So I think that I'm actually going to say that Washington ends up being the odd team out tonight at number 5. I think Georgia will be 3, and I think Michigan will be 4. And I think a lot of that will be, to your point, Jordan, some favorability from the committee, just knowing this is the team that's won their last 2 college football playoffs. I know that's not supposed to dictate anything, but with all of, I think there will be some, I don't know how else to put it other than some, not punishment from Michigan, but I do think that the committee will be thinking about the fact that some of the buzz that's out there about Michigan right now, it does make it very hard to decide what to do with them, given that they haven't really played anyone, but they've dominated everybody that they've played. But then there's also this dark cloud hanging over why they maybe dominated everyone that they've played. So Michigan's just a hard one to slot right now, but I think they do end up at number 4 behind Georgia.
It is kind of funny looking at Michigan. Obviously they've beaten some Big Ten opponents, but you could kind of make the argument that UNLV might be their best win just because of how good the Rebels. I think they're 6-1 or 6-2. So, it'll be interesting where they put Michigan. Kipp, what do you think? Where do you see this sort of slotting out between these 4, the top 4 teams in tonight's playoff?
Yeah, right now, I think in these initial rankings this is where you get the most variance. And I'm a best win guy. So Ohio State, definitely number 1. Like you guys said, Penn State, Notre Dame. I think that's an awesome resume for them to have already. I think those teams are probably going to be somewhere in the top 15 when those rankings come out today. So nobody else can claim that as of now. Florida State, that LSU win, that's still a team that's I think going to be in Atlanta once again. So I think that's going to be a strong win for them to have in their resume as number 2. For Georgia, it's just it's been the narrative all season for good or for bad, but Georgia has played with its food, played down to its competition. But I mean, whenever it gets ramped up, they play their best games. And Kentucky and Florida, I mean, they've won both those games by 3 touchdowns or more. Those are the 2 games they've covered this season. So they're going to get penalized by sleepwalking so far, and because of their schedule overall. But at the same time, I think they're gonna look at that resume in front of them and know that that and back-to-back titles. I think Georgia has the best chance of being in the top 2. When December rolls around. And then for me at 4, I mean, I kind of disagree with UNLV being the best win. I think Rutgers is the best win, and for Michigan, and I can't have a team in the top 4 that has Rutgers as its best win. I mean, that's not saying it's any better than UNLV or worse, but I just think that, those are the only teams, I guess, with winning records, but that's you can't work with that. You can't put a team even in the top five. It's really tough just to look at that schedule, and if someone's going to say Georgia hasn't played anybody, then Michigan definitely hasn't played anybody. So Washington has that win against Oregon right now. But looking ahead, if we're looking at these teams and knowing that usually these first playoff rankings, one or two of these teams don't make it in, you got to look at Washington. Go, they have some tough sledding ahead of them. I think the chances are very high that they're not in the college football playoff, even though I think right now they might be the toughest matchup, but they also just have the toughest slate. So the percentages just tell you that they might drop a game, if not two, before the season's done. But for tonight's purposes, I like those four, and I'm interested just to see again who's the first one-loss team. Is it Oregon? I think it should be. Is it Texas? They're in there, and then obviously everyone's going to want to know where Alabama is. I think they're probably 8th behind Texas and Oregon right now, which should make for some entertaining discussion on the message boards.
What do you guys think is the worst that Georgia could end up tonight?
I still think they're in the top 4. I'm still of the belief they would be 4th at worst, but I'm curious what you guys think.
I just think 3rd is right where it just makes the most sense. I think if you're 4th, then Kirby Smart's, doing fist pumps right now. And this is exactly, are you going to give this guy that kind of fuel that basically is telling him that they are, a 7-5 team in his eyes? So he'll put that on the bulletin board immediately. But I'd be kind of surprised if they're 4th. It doesn't really matter what they've done before, but they still are in that top 3 as far as margin of victory this season. So regardless of whether they've played down to their opponents, if you're in the top 3, if you're tied with Oregon, almost 24 points per game that you're beating your opponents by, I don't think you can get dinged too badly for the schedule they've played so far.
What's your thought, Ben, as far as the lowest they could be?
Well, I had me thinking when Kipp was talking about the best wins, and I think the committee oftentimes does live early in the year by best wins. And so, you could make the case that would put Georgia at 4 if they're valuing that Washington win over Oregon as highly. Because to Kipp's point, I think Oregon will be the highest ranked one-loss team. So that in many ways would give them a leg up over not just Georgia, just other teams' resumes as well. So I could see them being 4. I think that I can't see them being 5, even though I'm sure somebody could make the argument why Michigan should be ranked ahead of Georgia just because neither team has played overly wild schedules, even though I know Georgia's schedule has been more challenging than Michigan's has been. But you can make the case either way. So it's I was just sort of wondering, is there any world that Georgia ends up at 5, which to Kipp's point would be Kirby Smart's dream come true, even though he says he doesn't watch on Tuesdays?
Yeah, I would really beg him to stay in the media room tonight for the end of the ranking and just to see his reaction if that were to happen. I want to make this point too, because no matter where these rankings turn out, there will be a lot of discussion, as Kipp mentioned, on the message board, on the Junkyard. Let me say this very clearly. This does not matter. This first ranking means nothing. Pop quiz for you guys. Who was the number 1 team in the very first ranking last season?
Oh, gosh.
It was Tennessee, and that was right before they played Georgia.
Yeah.
So going back, I think 2014 was the very first time we had the playoff. Can either of y'all name me who was the number 1 team in the very first college football playoff ranking?
Mississippi State.
Mississippi State. You know what, Ben? What do both of those teams, Tennessee and Mississippi State, have in common?
Neither of them won the national championship.
Neither of them even made the college football playoff that year. So I would just tell everybody, just breathe. It will be okay. As long as Georgia takes care of business the rest of the way, they're going to make the college football playoff. And I can understand how some fans may feel slighted or may feel like, they're being disrespected. One, as Ben made the point, that's probably Kirby Smart's dream for that to happen. But 2, as long as you take care of business, you are going to be in the playoff, and you will have the opportunity to win 2 games and win another national title.
Both of those teams also thought it would be a good idea to try and hire Dan Mullen. I know Tennessee wasn't successful on that front because they lost out to Florida, but they both thought that it was a good idea.
Yeah, he just doesn't really like to recruit. If any of you guys heard Kirby after the game. All right, we're going to take a quick break, come back, and turn the attention to Missouri, what we're expecting to see from the Tigers, and a little talk about the visitors that Georgia will have in town for the matchup on Saturday afternoon. Welcome back, everybody. Well, yes, turning the attention to the upcoming game in Week 10 for Georgia playing Missouri, another team that it's going to be very interesting to see where they fall in this college football playoff ranking with the one loss home to LSU, a really competitive game that the LSU Tigers were able to pull out in that fourth quarter. Really interesting what we've heard from players so far this week, as well as Kirby Smart. A lot of respect for Eli Drinkwitz, what he's done there. I'll be honest, I really thought that Eli would probably be on the hot seat this season. I thought that they would struggle, probably be around 500, and they've done an outstanding job. Brady Cook, Cody Schrader, Luther Burden, who Georgia fans remember quite well from when he was being recruited. Interesting, too, to hear vets like Cedric Van Pran talk about how much last year's win sort of set Georgia up to play the way it did the rest of the year, especially when it came to the Peach Bowl and not panicking, being able to come back against Ohio State after they did something very similar to Missouri. I'll start with you, Ben. What do you make of what we've heard so far this week, just getting ready for Missouri, and your initial thoughts about the Tigers and what we could see on Saturday?
Well, I think it ties into some of what we talked about with the Florida game, in that we started to feel like this Georgia defense, which maybe it had some questions asked about it, has a little bit more juice in it than we initially thought. And I think that the remaining thing that we want to figure out is how does that stand up against a better offense? And, I think Missouri has proven through the skill players that they have, the explosiveness that they have, and then the way that Brady Cook has been playing, and then the way that Eli Drinkwitz calls a game, that I think this Missouri team is going to be the best offense so far that Georgia has seen. I mean, Georgia's only faced so far, I think, one team in the top 50 in scoring offense. I think that was Kentucky, and then one team in the top 50 in total offense, and I think that was UAB. So Georgia hasn't played many, supreme offenses this year. I think that will change on Saturday. Whether or not the outcomes look much different is what I don't really know yet, because I think that this Georgia defense probably will stand up pretty well against this Missouri offense. That said, Kirby was asked about it yesterday. He was asked sort of specifically about Luther Burden, but more generally just about their offense in general. And he said, you've got to stop what they do well. You've got to try and limit what they're able to do. And obviously they're going to try and get Luther Burden the football. You're not necessarily going to stop Luther Burden, but how do you contain him? How do you game plan for him so that you make other guys beat you? Now, Missouri has some other guys out there. I mean, Kirby mentioned yesterday, and it's very not rare, I guess, but he very specifically called out 3 wide receivers for Missouri that they have. So when they're game planning and they're thinking of, numbers on the other side that they're going to be calling out to their defensive guys, they have very clearly laid out, like, these are the 3 wide receivers that you need to be thinking about. He mentioned the tight end. He mentioned the running backs that they have that have some experience. But going into this game, Georgia's focus is going to be on Luther Burden and then Theo Weiss and that passing offense. And I think that, I expect Georgia to have a successful day back at home for the first time in a few weeks, but it will be really interesting to see how does Georgia stand up against what to this point in the season is the best offense that they've faced, specifically passing offense. And I think it's interesting too, because, they haven't played many good offenses so far, but as you look toward the next few weeks, Ole Miss, Tennessee, even Georgia Tech, and, potentially LSU, the offenses that Georgia is going to be facing down the stretch are much different to the ones that they faced at the beginning of the season. I think this is going to be the time that we start to see what that looks like.
Kirby really, really spoke highly of Brady Cook and the job he's done, and the fact that he's so experienced, which is definitely going to set them up well. Kipp, what are your initial thoughts about Missouri and what we should be on the lookout for in this game on Saturday?
Well, this is the opportunity for Georgia's secondary to back up all the praise we've given them this season. I mean, Kamari Lassiter has been someone who hasn't been talked about, and just like offensive tackles, you don't want to hear your cornerbacks talked about a lot. That means no one's throwing to them, and they're not being tested. But you're not going to be able to avoid that this weekend. I think Malachi Starks is grown up and played some pretty solid football. You're coming off maybe the best game for Tyke Smith since he's got to Georgia. Those guys are going to have to continue to get better playing next to each other. And I think they're just, they're going to be tested, as much as they've been this season. I think this is an opportunity for them to kind of showcase. But at the same time, that pass rush has to go back-to-back weeks and kind of and get home and not let Brady cook, cook. As they say, you're going to have to make sure that they don't get in the red zone, because Georgia last season was, I guess, the best red zone offense in college football. And so far this season, that's Missouri. They have the top red zone offense in college football. And I think it's interesting that they have the number 2 running back in the SEC so far this year. And he's a former walk-on from Truman State, the Truman State Bulldogs, and Cody Schrader. I think, again, the traditional run game probably plays to Georgia's strengths, but they have allowed, I guess, 4 yards or more in almost half of the plays. This isn't the run defense that we've kind of seen the last 2 seasons, and everyone kind of knows that. So I think that for Georgia, you have to just make sure you don't let them get into short yardage situations on third down, because that's when Georgia's defense plays its best. When it's obvious passing downs, that is when the pass rush comes alive. And so they got to make sure that they're not allowing Schrader to get 3 and 4 yards a carry on first and second down that makes life easier for Cook. So I think that's kind of what I'm watching right now. I think offensively they're kind of humming along right now, running a lot of 11 personnel, and I think that while this is probably the second best defense they faced this season, I think most would agree Auburn was the best defense they've faced. And is, again, like we said before the season, was a team that was going to be one of the more underrated defenses in the conference this season. Missouri's defense is good enough to at least, keep Georgia honest and make Georgia earn it. And like I said before earlier in the show, you don't want to trade touchdowns with field goals. You got to get it done in the red zone. And so I think that's going to be huge for Georgia in a game that could be a little bit, will it be a shootout? Maybe not, but it's got a chance to be one of the higher scoring games that Georgia plays this season.
I think, Kipp, you made a lot of good points. To me, this sort of mirrors what played out in 2022 with Georgia, in the fact that the Georgia offense needs to take care of the ball early on. They really struggled. I remember there was at least one fumble in that first half against Missouri and Columbia. Got to take care of the football. And to me, the guy that's going to be the key for Georgia winning this game is going to be Tyke Smith, because he is going to be tested. He's had his moments. There's been moments where he's given up plays, but he's also got 4 interceptions. And he's a guy that I think has done a really good job at star this season. But he's probably going to be covering Luther Burden quite a bit, and he's going to be challenged. He's got to show up ready to go. I think that, again, you kind of want to see the growth and the continuation of how that defense played against Florida. That was the best the pass rush has looked all season. Thought Jalen Walker really, really flashed. Even guys like Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, again, you want to see those guys that have been around and you're sort of waiting for them to flip the switch. I want to see if that happens against a really good Missouri offense, because we know that if you let a guy with as much experience as Brady Cook has get back there and work and hit some of those really talented receivers, could make for a very long day for the Georgia Bulldogs.
Yeah, and on the flip side, Missouri, they blitz a lot. I think over a third of the time they're trying to generate a pass rush via the blitz, and they get home a lot. You look at the last 2 weeks, they've got 9 sacks against Kentucky and South Carolina. Now, granted, we know South Carolina's offensive line is, the worst this side of Tuscaloosa. But the fact is, Missouri's got 24 sacks on the year, and all the praise that I just heaped on the offensive line for Florida, they're going to have a tall task this week. And Carson Beck having enough time to sit back there and pick them apart, which I think he has the ability to do because they do give up a lot of explosives, which makes sense when you're that aggressive as far as trying to get to the quarterback. There are opportunities there, but I do think that this is one of, if not the best pass rush that Georgia's faced all season. So also, just like I said with the secondary, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on this offensive line to keep Carson Beck upright.
Make sure and talk about some of the people that are going to be in the stands for Georgia on Saturday, another big recruiting weekend for the Bulldogs. So we're recording this on Tuesday afternoon. Ben, just what can you share on what we're expecting from some of the prospects who will be in Athens and who will be taking in this game between the Bulldogs and the Tigers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these next 2 weekends will, it goes without saying, be huge recruiting weekends for Georgia because it's the last 2 home games of the season for Georgia. Lucky for them, they both are appearing to be really good matchups. And I think as we look ahead to the Ole Miss game, there's a possibility that that's a 7 p.m. or 7:30 kick. And, we won't know that until next week. But if that ends up being the case, I think next week has a chance to be a really star-studded group for Georgia's last home game. This weekend, it's really early in the week, so there's a lot more that are going to be added throughout the course of the week. A couple big ones that we know already. Cam Michael is a defensive back, wide receiver out of Statesboro, Georgia. He's someone that we've mentioned a lot. He took an official visit to Georgia before I even started covering Georgia for Dogs 24/7 back in May. And at the time, there was a lot of buzz around him ending up in Georgia's class. As he always articulated to us, he was going to wait and take his time. I think this has really come down to 3 schools: Georgia, Tennessee, and Colorado. Georgia has theoretically slipped in recent months, and I think that it's not so much that he's slipped. I just think that he was never quite as close to committing to Georgia as it seemed was the case. And so now as it gets down to it, I think Georgia is in the conversation here. I just think that he hasn't been on campus since that official visit. So I think getting him on campus for this game will be big. Having some of those conversations around position fit. I mean, he's a guy that Georgia had recruited as a defensive back, and a lot of other schools had recruited as a receiver. Georgia has now since told him that he has an opportunity to play wide receiver at Georgia, but I still think those are some conversations that need to be had in person. They really need to get down to it and have some of those discussions. So I don't know how much that will be able to be discussed this weekend, obviously with Georgia having a game, but getting him back on campus is really, really big. I think that when you look ahead to future classes, a guy that will now be at his 3rd Georgia game this year is 2025 edge rusher Zayden Walker. That's a guy that is in the conversation for best football players that Georgia will be recruiting in the 2025 class. And so I think, getting him back on campus this weekend is huge just because, obviously he's an in-state guy. He's really highly rated. So it's not crazy for him to get to Athens multiple times, but 3 times through 8 weeks is, I think, an indicator that he's very strongly considering Georgia among his top contenders. So I think those are the 2 that really stand out to me right now. There is a long list of commitments: Dylan Raiola, Daniel Calhoun, Andre Evans, who flipped from LSU a couple weeks ago. This will be his first game visit in Sanford since becoming a Georgia commit. So there's a lot of, guys that you're familiar with seeing in Athens that will be there for the game this weekend. I think that what the disclaimer I want to put out there is there's going to be some other names that surface throughout the course of the week. There's some big ones that, and I'm not saying that he's going to be there, but Cam Coleman is a Texas A&M wide receiver commit that Georgia has been trying to get on a visit. KJ Bolden is a guy who visited earlier in the year and obviously is communicating with Georgia on a regular basis. These aren't guys that I'm sitting here reporting or saying are going to be at Georgia games either of the next 2 weekends, but with 2 game visits left, Georgia is obviously going to be trying really hard to get some of these high profile buzz recruits on campus. The one guy that I do want to sort of wrap up mentioning is North Carolina State wide receiver commit Terrell Anderson. So he told me last week that he's planning to take an official visit to Georgia this weekend for the Missouri game. I think there's still some, finalizing schedules there to make sure that's able to happen with playoff football coming up here as well. But what I'll note on that is if he is able to make that official visit this weekend, I really like Georgia's chances with Terrell Anderson. He's a guy that I think really highly of. He shot up the 24/7 sports rankings. Brian McClendon went to go see him a few weeks ago, and he had like 8 receptions for 140 yards and a couple touchdowns. So Terrell Anderson's a name that I would look at as a potential, imminent things are happening if he's able to make that official visit. But again, I always want to put that disclaimer with recruiting. If you don't actually make those visits, it ends up changing the course of things as well. So we'll keep an eye out on Terrell Anderson potentially getting in Athens this weekend.
Kip, what do you make of what this visitor list is shaping up to be, and especially understanding that you might see guys like Terrell Anderson join the list and wind up being there?
Yeah, that's kind of the position I'm watching right now. Georgia has obviously had some guys come off the commitment list at the receiver position, like a guy like Nikar, and their receivers like Nitro Tuggle is being heavily recruited by Notre Dame and Michigan. Hasn't really been able to get back on campus because of his senior season, but at the same time, I mean, you're still watching other schools heavily recruit him. So if you're Georgia, I mean, you got to still plan for the possibility that he is not in this class when all is said and done. And so, for that reason, I'm watching Terrell Anderson very closely. I think, if signing day were today, he might be on Georgia's commitment list when all is said and done. But, obviously it's not. And I keep coming back to Cam Michael, and I think at the end of the day, I think Georgia finds a way to get him in the fold as well. I just think that's one of those where today, no. Probably like Colorado would be a team I think has a lot of buzz in his recruitment right now because they've made him a priority as a wideout. And obviously that offense is got a lot of people excited about the future there. But I do think that in the end, I think that's a recruitment where Georgia's going to be able to convince Cam Michael to stay home, that they're going to give him an opportunity to play whatever position he wants to play at Georgia, whether that's wide receiver, whether that's, giving him a chance on both sides of the ball. I do think that he's that guy that, I want to see if he's on campus again this weekend. That recruitment's continuing. It's had a lot of ups and downs. It's been a roller coaster. We've had him in projected classes, early in April, May, June, and then thought, he was going to be headed elsewhere. I still think that pendulum's going to swing back in Georgia's favor when all is said and done. And that's why this time of the year gets kind of exciting in recruiting.
A lot to follow there with who makes it to Athens on Saturday. Be sure to stay tuned to dogs247.com. Ben and Kip will have all the information, so watch out for that going through the week. I want to make sure, too, and plug on Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to be joined by Callum McAndrew from the Columbia Daily Tribune. Is going to tell us all about Missouri, sort of what we expect to see. Saw where Jimmy Thompson on Facebook asked for our score predictions. You will get our score predictions in that Wednesday podcast when we talk to Callum. Gonna get ready to wrap up this episode with probably an extended Georgia men's basketball minute. Quite a bit to talk about from the Bulldogs. Played on Monday night in an exhibition game against Eastern Kentucky. Win that game 99-82. Was very, very impressed with what we saw in that game. Probably the most impressive player was R.J. Melendez, Illinois wing, who had transferred in this offseason, had battled injuries during his last season with the Fighting Illini. He played very, very well. 21 points, 9 rebounds. We talked to him after the exhibition. He nearly had the double-double with like 2 or 3 minutes left, had a ball like pretty much land in his lap, and he dropped it. So he was a little bit upset about missing out on a double-double, but super impressed by him. Silas Demery Jr., who is a 4-star point guard that they signed, a former USC commit. He got the start, which honestly kind of surprised me, but he played really, really well. I think he's a guy who's going to start on this team and has a chance to be very, very productive. Russell Chiwa, the 7-foot center they got from USF, he winds up with a double-double. I believe he had 10 points and 11 rebounds. A lot to like. They really pushed the tempo. They played really well against what is a good Eastern Kentucky team. They were the CBI runner-up last year. And credit to Georgia. I mean, they controlled that game from the tip and were able to win it. And what I thought was very interesting, again, it was an exhibition, but you scored 99 points. That was far more than they scored in any game last year in Mike White's first season. They had 57 points at halftime. If you compare that to the exhibition last year against Georgia College, I believe Georgia ended up with 66 points from both halves. So a lot to like with Georgia basketball. I'm very interested to watch next Monday when they take on Oregon in Las Vegas. Guys, I don't know if you can kind of help me making sure that 24/7 gets that trip approved. For some reason, our boss is not returning my calls about a trip to Vegas. But I will say that's going to be a very interesting matchup to watch Oregon and to watch Georgia face former Bulldog Kyrio Aquino, who is now playing with the Ducks. So that is going to be something to watch. And another note with Georgia men's basketball is on the recruiting side. Tuesday at 5:30 Eastern time, Jacob Wilkins, a 6'7", 167-pound small forward from Loganville, Georgia, is going to be announcing his commitment. He's either choosing Georgia or Virginia. And probably worth mentioning, Jacob Wilkins, he is the son of former Georgia Bulldog and Atlanta Hawks legend Dominique Wilkins. So going to be very interested in watching that. We have him listed at 6'7". I saw where Dominique was quoted earlier this week saying he's like close to 6'10 or 6'11 at this point. So very, very interested there. Put this on the board earlier on Tuesday morning. I really like Georgia's chances to land Jacob Wilkins. So coming off of getting a 5-star Asa Newell in next year's class, you got a chance to land a very, very talented 2025 member of the 2025 class, Jacob Wilkins. Things are really looking up for Mike White and company right now, especially when it comes to the recruiting trail and what they're trying to build in Athens.
Dominique Wilkins, no different than all other recruits' parents, just letting the 24/7 writers know that they don't have their player card correct.
Right. You know, he's just a dad at the end of the day. That's for sure. Watch this transition. I'm so proud of what I'm about to do right here. When we finish the exhibition on Monday night, there were no more questions, and Mike White said, "All right, I've got a question. What are you guys dressing up for for Halloween?" None of the riders had any response. I don't know that anyone is going trick-or-treating among us. But he said he may be pulling out Ricky Bobby. So I'm really hoping there's a photo. He did lean into the mic and say, "If you ain't first, you're last." So that was a very fun thing to see from Mike. Guys, thinking back to when you guys were kids, what was your favorite Halloween costume? I'm going to start with Kipp. What do you feel like was either your favorite or the best Halloween costume you ever had?
Oh my gosh. I think for me, it was always Randy Johnson and the exploding bird. I had a friend across the street who just dressed up as the bird, just feathers all over him. And I dressed up as Randy Johnson, and that was, we went out door to door. Just that was it. I mean, that was my favorite one, just because that was like my favorite sports memory, just seeing a bird explode. So, yeah, that's got to be my favorite.
Ben, what you got?
You know, as a kid, I probably didn't participate in Halloween as much as most other kids did. Now, what I usually do is I throw on a Santa Claus hat and a Santa Claus beard, because I just figure if I can find a way to somehow, ruin Christmas and Halloween for everybody all at the same time, I do that. So I usually go to answer trick-or-treaters at the door as if I'm Santa Claus, just hoping that maybe, a little kid that still believes gets a little bit confused what's going on.
I'm going to go trick-or-treat at Ben's tonight. I know that much. I think mine would have to be Batman when I was like 7 or 8.
Yeah.
I mean, that was just so cool. And that was like right after that run of movies that were so popular in the 90s. I mean, letting a kid be Batman, I mean, that was, you might as well be dressed up as God. That was so cool to be like 8 or 9 years old.
That utility belt was pretty clutch, man. It's pretty fun.
If you tell me that did not earn me another Kit Kat or two, I'm going to call you a liar. That's for sure. Well, we're going to get out of here on that very, packed episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I appreciate Kipp and Ben for popping on. Appreciate everyone who watched us live and everyone who is listening to this after the fact. Be sure to go to dogs247.com if you haven't already. Subscribe. Got all kinds of football news, football recruiting, basketball news, basketball recruiting on Dogs 24/7. Also go to YouTube, Dogs 24/7. We've got all these podcasts. We've got Kirby Smart press conferences. We've got player interviews, and we got Mike White press conferences and player interviews there as well. Again, I want to plug on Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern time. Going to have Callum McAndrew on to talk about Missouri. Should learn quite a bit from that podcast. So for Kipp Adams and Benjamin Wolk, I am Jordan Hill. Everybody take care, and everybody have a great Halloween.